For your ears only for the week of April 28th and May Day, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Catherine Herzog.
Something's not right here. I don't want to be judgmental, but I want to make sure that we're safe.
Yeah.
Between Benghazi and Boston, we're going backward in national security. This administration is letting its guard down, and it is beginning to show.
I'm disappointed. We need to give them a safe zone. We need to supply them with weapons going to the right people, and we need to be prepared to secure these caches of chemical weapons in the event that Bashar uses them or after he falls, that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
The Obama administration last week found itself in a two-front war over national security. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham was foremost among critics of a seeming FBI and CIA failure to keep tabs on one of the suspected Boston Marathon bombers. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, killed in a shootout with police after being tipped 2 years ago by Russia to his possible Islamist self-radicalization. And Arizona's GOP Senator John McCain was only the most outspoken critic of President Obama's continued insistence on more confirmation of chemical weapons use in Syria before escalating aid to rebel forces there, whose most effective units, ironically, are also Islamic radicals.
Meanwhile, the surviving Boston bombing suspect, 19-year-old Johar Tsarnaev, was read his Miranda rights in a Boston hospital, then moved to a detention facility, but not before reportedly disclosing the location of a ditched laptop and indicating that he and Tamerlan had talked about exploding their remaining arsenal of homemade bombs in New York's Times Square. To consider the challenges both of Boston and Syria and the complex military, security, intelligence, and constitutional issues involved. For Your Ears Only, we're joined again by 28-year CIA veteran Paul R. Pillar, now a visiting professor at Georgetown University for security studies and a commentator at nationalinterest.org and consortiumnews.com. Welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you.
Intelligence services in Russia picked up increasing Islamist interest by Tamerlan on the internet, even before he traveled there. Did U.S. anti-terrorism systems fail by simply looking for evidence of past or present criminal activity when protection against prospective terror is the goal? Were they not asking or prevented from asking the right questions?
You know, if we're talking about a kind of predictive mind reading about how someone might, in a subsequent year, go radical enough to get into terrorism, that's nothing that not only no government agency can do, but no one can do.
Well, Tamerlan was placed on some watch lists, but should he have been monitored more closely and certainly questioned after his return from 6 months in the Caucasus, which was precisely the trip Russian intelligence had been worried about?
Well, the list that he was put on was the so-called TIDE database, which is the most basic and most inclusive of these lists. There are literally hundreds of thousands of names on it. It is simply something where when a name comes up with even the slightest possibility that there might be of interest in this person from a counterterrorist point of view, the name goes on. You're certainly not going to want, I certainly don't want, all those people being subject to some kind of monitoring or surveillance. And in the absence of additional reasons to be placed on one of the more restrictive lists, no, I don't think anything different should have been done.
Is there within the FBI and CIA a reluctance to cooperate with Russian intelligence, given the brutality on both sides of its conflict with violent Islamists?
I think the issue here, and an issue in general with the Russians, is what the Russian authorities would consider as a matter of concern to them is not to be equated with a terrorist concern for us. And for the Russians, any uppity, let alone at least slightly radical Chechen, they would define as a threat. That is not to be equated with what we would consider as a terrorist threat.
President Obama ultimately decided that surviving suspect Johar Tsarnaev, a naturalized U.S. citizen, would not be treated as an enemy combatant, as many conservatives demanded. But do you think a federal magistrate moved too quickly to read him his Miranda rights and offer government counsel after 16 hours of interrogation under the so-called public safety exception?
No, 16 hours is more than enough to get whatever information they were going to get with regard to the immediate threats, if any, to the public that come under the so-called public safety exception. And that's true even though in this case you had a detainee who had an injured throat, and he was responding in writing rather than verbally.
Let's turn to Syria and the administration's belated agreement with Britain, France, and Israel that there is evidence suggesting at least limited use of chemical weapons. What kind of evidence would be conclusive, and is it realistic to count on getting it?
Well, it's probably not realistic to count on getting it. I suppose the only thing you might call conclusive evidence, if you're talking about regime use of it, would be some eyewitness accounts, multiple ones, that say, Syrian government forces, fired these projectiles over at these opposition personnel, and the latter immediately contracted the symptoms of being subject to poison gas. And until we get something like that, I think we in the public are still going to be pretty much in the dark about exactly what happened.
We understand that President Obama and the nation are reluctant to get more deeply involved in another Mideast war. But even if he were not, how realistic are the kind of responses critics like Senator McCain are calling for? A no-fly safe zone, weapons for the least unfriendly rebel forces, protection of chemical weapons from the most unfriendly rebels in the regime?
Yes, it would be possible to set up a no-fly zone. But, unlike, say, the Iraqi Kurds or even the Iraqi Shia who are concentrated in the southern part of that country, here we have a rebellion, a civil war that is spread all through Syria. And so whatever zone you set up would possibly benefit some of the rebels and would be basically irrelevant to many of the other ones. When you're talking about providing aid to the good rebels and opponents while trying to keep it out of the hands of radicals that we might not like, well, that's a worthy goal, but in practice, I think it's rather infeasible given the still inchoate and rather disorganized nature of the Syrian opposition. But I think the most important set of issues is even if you could get around those practical problems, there's the larger one of just where does this all lead? You could set up no-fly zones, you can provide lethal or non-lethal aid. That doesn't necessarily, and in my belief, it probably wouldn't at all, hasten the end of this civil war and the bloodshed. It might just fuel the violence to an even greater extent in the short and medium term.
To what degree does a lack of response to Syrian chemical weapons weaken U.S. warnings about Iran's nuclear program, North Korea also?
We've made a mistake in drawing or implying red lines in the first place. That boxes us in when we subject ourselves to these kinds of debates afterwards. But number two, even if that mistake has been made, there is a general tendency to overstate the damage to U.S. credibility in the eyes of other regimes, including ones we consider adversaries, because we are seen as not living up to this or that commitment. The way other regimes look at us is to consider whatever our interests and motivations are for whatever is the issue directly at hand. So if it's, say, the North Koreans, they are going to look at what our interests are in East Asia and vis-a-vis North Korea itself, rather than drawing grand conclusions about something we did or did not do with regard to a particular category of weapons back in the Middle East.
Paul R. Pillar is a 28-year CIA veteran, now visiting professor at Georgetown University for security studies. He posts commentary at nationalinterest.org and consortiumnews.com.
Quote from the news, people fighting against corruption should be absolutely pure themselves. Otherwise, it all looks like political self-advertising. That was Russian President Vladimir Putin during his record 5-hour TV appearance in which he justified criminal charges for alleged infractions by various critics and watchdog groups.
Next, the Federalist Society and blemishes on the Bush legacy. For your ears only.